kinda has the reputation of being born from the swamp goblins deep inside the dungeons. Kinda has a reputation for being in your face, being very aggressive, being very evil, and harboring black incantations. And even the bands of antiquity prided themselves on playing as fast as they could, or challenging norms with the things that they wrote about, or challenging norms with vocals. But anytime you have something that is very well established, there are obviously going to be people that come along and try to do the antithesis of it. There's a big contingency of metalheads that just do not particularly like atmosphere in music for one reason or another, which is fair. If something isn't your cup of tea, that's perfectly fine, but most of the time it just comes down to it's too well produced, they want their metal to be very raw, and that can kind of be the hallmark for why a lot of folks listen to metal in the first place. Is they want something that is very aggressive and in your face because it helps them vent out their frustrations, or they just like the intensity of the music because it scratches an itch that no other genre really is capable of scratching. So obviously something that goes against that in some way, in this case atmosphere, which usually goes hand in hand with good production but not always, it can obviously challenge that a little bit and get people a little upset because they think it goes against what metal is to begin with. I think there are very tasteful ways to incorporate atmosphere in metal, and I don't think it necessarily has to mean that your production is god-awful or that you're lo-fi, in the same way that I don't think it means that your production has to be very sharp and sanitized. There is a middle ground to be found. There are bands that toe the line, and there are very raw and lo-fi bands and very well produced bands. It definitely is a spectrum. I've said on this channel that I err much more on the side of atmosphere than I do brutality a lot of times. Now with that being said, I love brutality in music. I love Heaviness. Some of my favorite albums are the ones that just grind me into smithereens until I am just a writhing pile of ooze on the ground. That was the grossest analogy I've ever... Basically, I like despondent stuff. I like dystopia in my music. Texturally, I think that brutality and intensity can provide just as fun of an experience as atmosphere, but I think the brutal side of metal is never going to be capable of doing what some of the atmospheric bands are going to be able to do, in the same way that atmospheric bands can't do what brutal bands do necessarily, unless you're one of the bands that have a little bit of both, which I think those are obviously the best types of bands, the hybrid bands, the ones that can incorporate a lot of influences and still sound really good. I've said before that heaviness in music doesn't automatically make it good, and brutality can really do a lot for emotion and provoking some sort of response through you, whether it be fear, anxiety, anger, just whatever it may be. I think it can incorporate a lot of different emotions into the instrumentation, but more often than not, atmosphere, 9 times out of 10, if not 10 times out of 10, is going to curb stomp brutality when it comes to feelings of sorrow, of sadness, of emotion, provoking some sort of depth and dimension, making you think philosophically. I feel like I have more experiences like that with atmospheric records than I ever do brutal records, and they are both very good in their own lane, and it doesn't invalidate one or the other. But bands like Era and Invent Animate, Agalok, as well as The Contortionist, they are so beautiful in their atmosphere, and it doesn't mean that you have to compromise or sacrifice heaviness, because back in the 1990s you saw a lot of symphonic black metal bands come on the scene that were still very heavy. Look at bands like Emperor or the entirety of the melodic death metal scene. I know that a lot of people think that death metal should have always stayed in the subterranean gates of hell, but in the grand scheme of things, bands like Dark Tranquillity, At the Gates, Amon Amarth, In Flames, Arch Enemy, they are really good in their own right. Even bands like Carcass. Melody and harmony does something for music that a lot of just heavy, brutal music cannot necessarily do. But on the flip side of that coin, brutal music can be much more aggressive than atmospheric music could ever hope to achieve. The two can coexist. You can have very atmospherically dense, heavy records. I would say that Sayor, the solo black metal project, atmospheric black and folk metal project, whatever you want to call it, can fit that bill. I think that a black metal project like Alhava with the record Frozen Bloom, I think that a lot of the sort of vintage black metal lo-fi projects like Keck or Rock can do that, or Perennial Isolation. Those are all fantastic names for fantastic, like, atmospheric black metal music that I would still classify as being very heavy. Is it heavy from an emotional department? Yes, but is it also heavy from an instrumentation and vocal department? I would also say yes. And heaviness can be very subjective, because while a lot of people associate heaviness with what it sounds like, heaviness doesn't necessarily have to just be what it sounds like. It can be the topic matter. I would describe a record like A Crow Looked at Me by Mount Eerie, or some of Loma Prieta and Law Dispute's works, or Circle Takes the Square and classic screamo bands, or newer screamo bands like Heaven in Her Arms, as being very emotionally heavy just as much as they are instrumentally heavy. I'm personally pulled to atmosphere in music because I like emotional music. music. I like music that makes me feel and makes me think. I like the way it provokes emotion, and in the same way that a brutal record like Caustic by Primitive Man makes me feel anxious and fearful and distraught and despondent, I think that a lot of atmospheric music can really provide a great baseline for people that really do love to feel deep emotion, to emotionally capture vibes that brutal music can't, and really burrow its way into your head, especially if you're a deep thinker, if you're someone that likes philosophy, or if you're someone that deals with mental health stuff. I feel like that outlet can mean a lot, and I think that's why a lot of people like DSBM music, because DSBM I would classify under the atmospheric edge, even though objectively a lot of them are very heavy. Or a record like Mirror Reaper by Bell Witch is objectively very crushing from a production department. It hits you like a 5,000 mile high skyscraper, but emotionally it's the riffs and what constitutes that emotion that makes it so memorable and makes it such an incredible release to examine and to listen to, and really gets into your soul, gets into your heart, makes you feel that emotion. And when Architects wrote a record like All Our Gods Have Abandoned Us, or specifically Holy Hell, when they lost a key member of the band, that emotion bled through, even though it was a very heavy metalcore sound at the time. The list goes on and on, but you don't necessarily have to be heavy from an instrumental department to be atmospheric, and you don't have to not be heavy to be atmospheric. They can coexist, and there are a lot of bands and albums that blur the lines. Look at Agaloc's The Mantle, one of my favorite records of all time, or Drift by Era, or any of Era's records actually. And we saw in the 2010s how Black Gaze took over so many people's lives and got a ton of people into metal with bands like Death Heaven, bands like Alcest, some of early Wolves in the Throne Room. So there definitely always is a place for heaviness but also atmosphere, and I think a lot of the black and deathcore bands are touching upon this as well, like the Lorna Shores and the Mental Cruelties, the Worm Shepherds. I think that they also capture that very well, while still maintaining some of the heaviest, most crushing riffs you could ever have. So one isn't necessarily better than the other. There isn't a right or wrong way to make metal, or to make brutal or atmospheric metal, and you can mix the two and it can make a really deadly combination for some of the best metal music you're ever gonna hear. I understand that this video is very much aimed at like the 1990s forward, but pretty much the reason for that is while there were atmospheric bands and bands that incorporated melody and atmosphere in their music 1980s back, most of the extreme metal genres in the 1980s and 1970s that got their stylistic roots were very heavy, were focused on speed. They weren't necessarily the most technical, and they weren't really worrying about making something sound pretty or well polished or vintage. They were the vintage. So this definitely is a fairly modern thing if you consider the 1990s forward modern, but I'm sure there are plenty of bands and records and songs that you could talk about from like the 1980s back that would fit this bill as well. And I'll just leave it at this: some of the quietest rock songs you'll ever hear, and psychedelic rock songs of the 1970s, are emotionally heavier than a lot of the heaviest deathcore bands I've ever heard. Do with that what you will, but some of Pink Floyd's material hits like a ton of bricks. A brick in the wall, perhaps? That was such a bad joke. What are your guys' opinions of this topic? You can let me know down in the comment section below your opinions of atmosphere versus brutality and music. I would love to hear your responses to this. Agree or disagree, there is no wrong answer. And if you'd like to join the Metal Tempest Discord server, it's very active and pumping. It is down in a pinned comment in the comment section below, as well as in the description. Join if you would like. I'd love to have you there in the family. Be sure to like this video if you enjoyed it, subscribe to join the review family today, and smash that notification bell to be notified of my future uploads. You know who it is. My name is Jay Morris, and I'm signing off saying farewell.